At 9 p.m. on June 8th, 68 AD, the man once called the Light of the World, Emperor Nero Claudius Caesar, stood trembling in a dim Roman villa just outside the city gates. His empire had turned against him, his loyal guards had fled, and the Senate, the same Senate that had once bowed to him, had officially declared him an enemy of Rome. But in those final 24 hours, Nero's downfall wasn't just political, it was human, horrifying, and far darker than you could ever imagine. Because before the blade pierced his throat, before his final scream echoed through the marble halls, Nero didn't just lose his empire, he lost his sanity. Just 24 hours before his death, Nero was seen pacing barefoot through the corridors of his palace, whispering to invisible figures and mumbling the words, "What an artist dies in me." The once golden emperor who commanded thousands now couldn't even command his own trembling hands. But what exactly happened that drove the ruler of Rome, the man who burned Christians alive, who performed on stage while cities crumbled, to such a pitiful, paranoid end? To understand that, we need to go back to the very beginning of his final day. June 8th, dawn. The sun rose over Rome, but Nero did not. He hadn't slept for 3 days. His messengers brought him one dreadful letter after another. The generals had defected, the armies of Gaul had turned, and his own guards were plotting to hand him over to the Senate. Nero, the once untouchable god of Rome, had become the most hunted man in the empire. By mid-morning, Nero's private secretary, Epaphroditus, burst into the emperor's chambers, pale and trembling. The Senate had voted. Nero was officially condemned to death as a public enemy. His punishment? To be beaten to death in public, naked, his body hung on display in the forum. Nero froze, his face draining of color. For a man who spent his life obsessed with how he looked to others, this was worse than death itself. "Will they not allow me to die with dignity?" he muttered, half to himself. He ordered his servants to prepare horses. He would flee to the coast, find loyal soldiers, maybe sail to Egypt. But one by one, everyone he trusted abandoned him. His praetorian guards vanished, his friends pretended not to know him, even his concubines slipped away into the night. Within hours, the halls of his golden palace, once filled with music, dancers, and perfume, fell silent. Nero, who had once ruled millions, was now left with only 3 men, his secretary, Epaphroditus, his freedman Phaon, and 2 loyal slaves. They disguised him in torn rags and placed an old cloak over his head. The emperor, who once adorned himself in jewels, now looked like a beggar. They slipped out of the palace through a side gate, taking the back roads under the moonlight. Every rustle in the bushes, every shout in the distance made Nero flinch. At one point, the group passed a patrol of soldiers searching for him. Nero hid in a roadside ditch, covering his face in mud to disguise himself. For the first time in his life, the emperor, who called himself divine, was hiding like a criminal. As dawn approached, they reached a small villa owned by Phaon just outside the city. Exhausted, Nero collapsed on a simple straw bed, gasping, "I am deserted, deserted by all." The villa smelled of damp hay and old oil lamps, a far cry from the marble halls Nero once called home. As he lay trembling, drenched in sweat, every sound made him jolt upright. He imagined soldiers bursting through the doors. He imagined his head on a pike, paraded through the streets of Rome. "Is this what I've become?" he whispered. "An emperor hiding like a thief?" Epaphroditus tried to comfort him, reminding him of his achievements, the rebuilding of Rome after the Great Fire, his poetry, his performances. But Nero's eyes were vacant. His lips twitched with bitter laughter. "They called me a monster," he said. "But all I ever wanted was beauty, harmony. Even fire was beautiful, wasn't it?" He reached for a broken lyre that Phaon had kept in storage. Nero plucked its snapped strings with shaking fingers, humming a few notes from the song he had performed the night Rome burned. Then he stopped. The melody cracked mid-air, and Nero broke down, sobbing uncontrollably. Hours passed. No soldiers came, but the silence was worse. Nero kept muttering the same line. What an artist the world is losing. By evening, the hoofbeats of riders thundered in the distance. Nero jumped up, terrified. "They found me!" he screamed. The few men who remained urged him to flee through the back, but there was nowhere to go. The roads were blocked, and the villa surrounded by open fields. "Then, it's over," Nero whispered. His breathing quickened. His eyes darted from one man to another. "Do it quickly, then. Dig my grave before they arrive." The men hesitated. Nero grabbed a shovel himself, clawing at the dirt with trembling hands until the ground gave way. Sweat mixed with tears and soil. The once untouchable emperor was now digging his own tomb. As the night deepened, the air grew colder, and Nero's mind began to slip further into chaos. He paced the narrow corridor of Phaon's villa, his tattered cloak dragging in the dust. From the nearby hills, the faint glow of torches flickered. The Senate's men were closing in. Inside, Nero demanded a cup of water. When Phaon brought it, Nero stared at his reflection trembling on the surface. "So this," he said bitterly, "is the face Rome wants to destroy. The same face that gave them bread, games, and music. The same voice they once begged to hear sing again." But no one spoke. The room was filled only with the sound of Nero's labored breathing and the distant croaking of frogs. Then, a sudden wave of terror seized him. He clutched his throat. "Will no one show me how to die?" he asked, trembling violently. Epaphroditus tried to calm him, but Nero shoved him away. "Cowards! Do you want me to fall into their hands, to be stripped, beaten, mocked?" His voice cracked. "Even the dogs will laugh when they see me." He began pacing again, muttering incoherently about his mother Agrippina, the woman he had murdered years ago, and about Poppaea, his wife, whom he had kicked to death in a fit of rage. "They're all waiting for me down there," he whispered. "Mother, Poppaea, Seneca, every one of them." His voice softened to a whimper. "They'll call me a monster. But they never understood. I only wanted to be loved." He sank to his knees, clutching the broken lyre. Outside, a rooster crowed. Dawn was approaching. Nero looked up, tears streaming down his face. "Even the gods are mocking me," he said. "I am no longer emperor, only a ghost haunting my own empire." The first rays of dawn broke over the hills, painting the sky a pale red, a cruel reflection of the blood that was soon to spill. Inside the villa, Nero sat motionless, the broken lyre resting across his lap. His face was pale, almost wax-like, his lips dry and cracked. He turned to Epaphroditus, his voice barely more than a whisper. "The soldiers. They're coming, aren't they?" Epaphroditus hesitated. From afar, they could hear the rhythmic gallop of horses drawing near. Nero nodded slowly, as if accepting a truth he had long avoided. "Then it is time." He rose unsteadily to his feet. His tunic clung to his skin, soaked in sweat. He looked around the small room, at the clay walls, the cracked oil lamps, the frightened eyes of the few men who remained. "How pitiful," he murmured. "An emperor of Rome with no throne, no crown, no friends. Just fear." He pulled a small dagger from beneath his cloak, the same dagger he once carried at the height of his power, now dull and rusted. He weighed it in his hand, his eyes unfocused. "Courage," he said softly, as if reminding himself. "This is what my father taught me. Courage, even in death." But his hand trembled. He pressed the blade against his throat, then froze. Tears welled up in his eyes. "I can't," he gasped. "What an artist dies in me." His voice broke. "What an artist." The hoofbeats grew louder now. The soldiers were at the gate. Nero turned to Epaphroditus one final time. "Help me," he whispered. "Take the dagger. Press it." Epaphroditus hesitated, tears streaming down his cheeks. Nero closed his eyes. Together they drove the blade into his throat. A sharp gasp escaped his lips. And then, silence. The last emperor of the Julio-Claudian line had fallen, not in battle, but in fear. For a moment after Nero fell, no one spoke. The villa was silent, save for the faint hiss of the dying oil lamps. His body twitched once, then went still. The emperor, who had once commanded the might of Rome, now lay sprawled on a dirt floor, his robes soaked in blood. Epaphroditus dropped to his knees beside him, his hands trembling. "Is it done?" he whispered. Nero's lips moved faintly. His final words, according to legend, were, "Too late. This is fidelity." Then his eyes rolled back, and his head slumped forward. Outside, the soldiers finally arrived. When they entered the villa, they found only the lifeless body of the man they had come to arrest. For a long moment, no one dared speak his name. Even in death, Nero's presence was heavy, a reminder of both grandeur and madness. By noon, word spread through Rome. Nero is dead. Some cheered, others wept. But for many, disbelief lingered. For years after his death, impostors arose across the empire, claiming to be Nero reborn. They sang his songs, mimicked his gestures, and promised to reclaim the throne. To the Roman people, Nero had been more than a ruler. He was an idea, a ghost that refused to die. The Senate, fearing unrest, ordered his body to be cremated quickly. A small funeral was arranged in secret by his few remaining servants. As the pyre burned, the last flames of the Julio-Claudian dynasty faded into smoke. Yet Nero's death marked more than the end of a lineage. It was the death of Rome's innocence. Under his reign, art and cruelty had become indistinguishable. And in his final 24 hours, the artist-emperor who sought immortality through beauty found only horror, silence, and fire. In the years that followed, Rome tried to erase Nero's memory. His name was carved out from monuments, his statues melted, his image banned from coins. But despite their efforts, his shadow lingered. In every burnt scroll, every whispered story, every artist who dared to dream beyond their time. Even the emperors who came after him, Galba, Otho, Vitellius, feared the mere echo of his name. Because Nero's death hadn't ended his story. It had immortalized it. He became the symbol of corruption and chaos, of genius twisted by obsession. To some, he was a tyrant who destroyed everything sacred. To others, he was a tragic artist crushed beneath the weight of his own ambition. But perhaps the cruelest truth about Nero's final 24 hours is this. He didn't die as a monster. He died as a man, broken, terrified, and alone. A man who once commanded the applause of thousands, yet couldn't bear the silence of his own downfall, and maybe that's why his story still fascinates us today. Because behind every symbol of power lies a human being, desperate to be remembered, terrified to be forgotten. So, the next time you hear the name Nero, don't just think of the tyrant who burned Rome. Think of the trembling man digging his own grave under a pale Roman dawn, clutching a broken lyre, whispering to himself, "What an artist dies in me." And that wraps up today's look into the final 24 hours of Nero was far worse than you think. If you found this story as haunting as we did, make sure to drop a like, share it with your history-loving friends, and subscribe for more tales that uncover the truth behind history's most infamous figures. Let us know in the comments. Do you think Nero was truly evil or simply a victim of his own madness? Hours before Nero fled the palace, the great halls of the Domus Aurea, his fabled golden house, echoed with silence. The once gleaming walls, plated in gold and precious stones, reflected the trembling light of torches as if mocking the emperor's fading glory. He wandered aimlessly, brushing his fingers along the marble columns, whispering to himself like a man trapped in a dream. In that moment, the weight of his past began to crush him. He saw faces in the shadows: Agrippina, his mother, whose murder he had ordered; Poppaea, his pregnant wife, whom he had struck in a fit of rage; and Seneca, his old mentor, who had guided him as a boy and whom he had forced to take his own life. Each ghost whispered a single word: "Monster!" He clasped his hands over his ears and screamed, "I am not a monster. I gave them art. I gave them beauty." His voice cracked as tears welled in his eyes. They never understood me. They never loved me. For years, Nero had convinced himself that cruelty was simply the price of greatness. He believed that the people needed spectacle, whether through music, theater, or the burning of enemies. But now, stripped of power, he finally saw the truth. All the applause, all the cheers, had been hollow. They had never loved him. They had feared him. He stumbled into the banquet hall, where the scent of stale wine still lingered from his last feast. He looked around the empty tables, the overturned goblets, the broken statues of gods. His trembling hand reached for one final cup of wine. "To Rome," he muttered bitterly. "The city I loved more than it ever loved me." As the hours crept closer to midnight, Nero's messengers returned from every corner of the city, empty-handed. The generals he had once showered with gold now refused to answer his summons. The Praetorian Guard, his supposed protectors, had declared their loyalty to Galba. Even the servants who had once bowed at his feet now slipped away in silence, pretending not to see him as they fled through the corridors. For the first time in 14 years, the emperor was alone. He stormed into the audience chamber, kicking over the bronze bust of his own likeness. "Cowards! Traitors! Have they forgotten who gave them life?" His voice echoed through the vast room, bouncing off the frescoes that once depicted his triumphs. Now they looked like mockery, paintings of a god among mortals, staring down at the broken man beneath. He called for his treasurer, hoping to buy loyalty one last time, but even he had vanished, taking the imperial jewels with him. Nero grabbed a handful of coins from the table and hurled them at the floor. "So this is Rome," he spat, faithful only to gold. Then came the final blow, a messenger from the Senate. Nero tore open the wax seal and read the decree aloud. "Nero Claudius Caesar, enemy of the people." His hands shook. "Enemy of the people," he repeated, almost laughing. "I am the people. Without me, Rome would have burned to ash." But perhaps that was the cruelest irony. Rome had burned, and Nero had watched it from his tower, playing the lyre as flames devoured the city. The people never forgot. The senators never forgave. He slumped into his throne, eyes glazed. "They want my head," he whispered. "Then they shall have it." Outside, thunder rolled across the sky. A storm was coming, and with it, the end of Nero's reign. By the early hours of June 8th, thunder cracked across the dark Roman sky. The once mighty emperor of the world was now a fugitive. Wrapped in an old cloak, barefoot and trembling, Nero crept through the back gates of his palace. His remaining allies, Epaphroditus, Phaon, Sporus, and one loyal freedman named Doryphorus, led the way, holding flickering torches that barely cut through the rain. They moved through the narrow alleys, the same streets where Nero's parades once passed in glory. Now those streets were filled with whispers and fear. A few onlookers caught sight of him and gasped, recognizing the familiar pale face beneath the hood. "It's him," someone hissed. "The mad emperor." But none dared to approach. The people who had once screamed his name in celebration now hid behind doors as he passed. At one point, Nero stumbled. Epaphroditus tried to help him up, but the emperor pushed him away. "No," he said weakly. "Let me fall. It's what they all want." His voice cracked, not from arrogance, but exhaustion. I wish I had died before I lost their love." They paused beneath a cypress tree to rest. In the distance, the glow of Rome shimmered faintly. The city that had turned its back on him. Sporus, the young boy Nero once called his bride, quietly placed his cloak around the emperor's shoulders. Nero looked at him for a long time, then whispered, "Even now you stay." "Why?" Sporus lowered his gaze. "Because, my lord, no one deserves to die alone." Nero's lips quivered, but no words came. The man who had once demanded worship now found himself grateful simply to be pitied. As they approached Phaon's villa, the first light of dawn began to break through the clouds, signaling not salvation, but the beginning of Nero's final day. When Nero entered Phaon's humble villa, the storm had quieted, but the silence was far more terrifying. The air was thick with the scent of wet earth and oil lamps. Every creak of the wooden beams made Nero flinch. He was no longer the godlike emperor who once stood over cheering crowds. He was a man hunted by his own people, haunted by the ghosts of everyone he had betrayed. He stumbled into the main room and collapsed on a straw mat. "This is how it ends," he muttered. "Not in marble halls, but in filth." His breath came in short bursts. Epaphroditus knelt beside him, trying to soothe him, but Nero's eyes were wide and unfocused. "They're coming, aren't they? The Senate, the soldiers, my mother." He clutched his temples, shaking violently. "She's here. She's come for me." Epaphroditus exchanged worried glances with the others. Nero was seeing things no one else could. Suddenly, he pointed toward the corner of the room. "There! Can't you see her? Agrippina, look!" His voice cracked into a scream. "She's smiling at me." He backed against the wall, trembling as if facing a real specter. "I gave her everything. Why won't she forgive me?" The others said nothing. They couldn't. To calm him, Phaon offered a small bowl of bread and milk. Nero pushed it away. "I don't eat like peasants," he spat, then immediately broke down, clutching the bowl in both hands. "I'm sorry," he whispered to no one in particular. "I didn't mean to burn it all." He crawled to a window, gazing out at the faint glow of Rome in the distance. "They'll erase me," he murmured. "They'll carve my name from stone, melt my statues, and call me mad. But one day, they'll remember my voice, my art, my fire." For a long time he stared at the horizon, rocking gently like a child. Then, in a tone eerily calm, he asked, "When they find me, will they bury me as an emperor?" Epaphroditus hesitated. "We'll do what we can, my lord." Nero nodded faintly. "Then dig my grave before they come." He began to help them, clawing at the dirt with his bare hands, nails tearing, lips quivering. "Quickly," he whispered, "before they make a spectacle of me." When the grave was done, he sat beside it, shivering. The torchlight flickered across his face, hollow, weary, and oddly peaceful. "So this is peace," he said softly. "No throne, no crown, just silence." But his peace didn't last. From afar, the faint echo of hooves reached the villa gates. Nero's eyes widened. "They're here," he whispered. "They've come for me." He looked at Epaphroditus, his voice trembling. "When I'm gone, tell them I wasn't afraid. Tell them I died as an artist." Epaphroditus's eyes welled with tears. "Yes, my lord." Nero smiled weakly. "Now, help me end the song." The sound of hooves drew closer. Every thud echoed through the villa, like the beating of a war drum. Phaon ran to the doorway, peering into the night. Torches flickered in the distance. The Senate's riders had arrived. Nero stood in the center of the room, drenched in sweat, his face drained of color. "It's over," he said quietly. "Even the gods have abandoned me." He glanced at the crude grave they had dug beside the stable. "So this is where the last emperor of Augustus' blood will rest, in dirt." Epaphroditus stepped forward, his voice trembling. "My lord, there is still time. We could flee." "Flee?" Nero interrupted, laughing bitterly. "To where? The seas hate me, the people curse me, and Rome herself spits my name. No, it's better this way." He reached for his dagger, the same weapon he once wore at his waist during triumphs through the Forum. It was dull now, flecked with rust. He turned it over in his shaking hand. "This blade once symbolized victory," he said softly, "and now it brings me peace." For a moment he hesitated. His breathing became shallow. "How strange," he murmured. "Death always seemed so far away, like a play I'd never perform." He looked at Sporus and managed a faint smile. "Don't cry. You must live. Tell them I died with dignity, like a true Roman." The sound of riders grew louder. Torchlights spilled into the courtyard. "Now," Nero said, voice cracking, "help me, Epaphroditus. Be quick before they come." Epaphroditus froze, tears streaking his cheeks. "I can't, my lord." "Then you are no friend," Nero rasped, pressing the dagger to his throat. His hand trembled violently, but he pushed forward. Epaphroditus finally grasped his arm and guided it. There was a sharp gasp. And then silence. Nero staggered, his eyes wide with disbelief. He tried to speak, but only a whisper escaped his lips. Too late. This is loyalty. His knees gave way and he collapsed beside the grave. Moments later, the Senate's soldiers burst through the door. They stopped dead in their tracks, torches raised high, staring at the lifeless figure before them. The Emperor of Rome, lying face down in the dirt, blood pooling beneath him. No one spoke. No one dared to touch him. The air hung heavy with a strange, reverent silence. Even the soldiers, hardened men of war, looked away. Phaon knelt and closed Nero's eyes. The Emperor's face, once contorted in terror, now seemed eerily calm, as if he had finally found peace in death that he never found in life. Outside, the storm had passed. The moon broke through the clouds, bathing the villa in pale light. The last of the Julio-Claudian line was gone. Rome had lost its emperor, and with him the final trace of the dynasty that had built its empire in blood. When word reached Rome that Nero was dead, the city did not roar. It sighed. For years, the empire had lived beneath his shadow, too terrified to speak, too exhausted to cheer. Now, that shadow had vanished, yet the silence that followed his death was uneasy, not victorious. The Senate convened in the Curia Julia at dawn. The marble floors were still slick from the night's rain as senators whispered in disbelief. Some demanded celebration, others called for a day of mourning. "The tyrant is gone," one man said. "Let us rebuild Rome without fear." Another replied, "He was our emperor, our blood. What if the gods punish us for rejoicing?" Galba, the governor of Spain, was declared the new emperor within hours. But even as his rule began, strange rumors spread across the empire. Whispers that Nero was not truly dead. Sailors swore they had seen him boarding a ship toward the east. Merchants claimed they heard his voice singing in faraway lands. And in the years that followed, 3 impostors would rise, each declaring himself Nero reborn. The people wanted to believe, because for all his cruelty, Nero had been more than a ruler. He had been a spectacle. He sang, acted, and performed like no emperor before him. His life had been a grand tragedy, and Rome, in its own twisted way, missed the drama. Meanwhile, his body, the body of the once divine emperor, was buried quietly by his remaining servants. No grand funeral, no public mourning, no golden tomb. Just a simple grave in the gardens of the Domitia family, far from the noise of the city he once commanded. But death did not end his story. Graffiti began appearing across the walls of Rome. "Nero lives," in taverns and marketplaces, Musicians sang forbidden songs once composed by his hand, and among the lower classes, the actors, the artists, the slaves, Nero became something unexpected, a symbol of defiance. "Say what you will," an old street performer once said, but no one made Rome feel alive like Nero did. To the Senate, he was a disgrace. To historians, a monster. But to the poor, he was the only emperor who had ever tried to entertain them, who had eaten among them, who had performed not as a god, but as one of their own. And so the myth of Nero refused to die. His name, carved out of marble and memory, lived on in whispers, in the songs sung under moonlight, in the fear of emperors who came after him. Because if Nero could rise once, who was to say he couldn't rise again? Centuries passed, yet the story of Nero never faded. Historians painted him as the embodiment of corruption, the man who murdered his family, burned his own city, and turned an empire into his personal stage. But beyond the Incan marble, another Nero remained, the restless artist who believed that beauty could justify madness. And maybe that was his greatest tragedy. Nero wanted to be loved not as a conqueror, but as a creator. He wanted applause, not obedience, admiration, not fear. But power is the cruelest audience of all. It applauds only until it finds someone new to cheer for. When archaeologists unearthed remnants of his golden house centuries later, they found frescoes of music, poetry, and starlight, the dreams of a man who thought himself eternal. Yet above those painted ceilings, time had carved its own verdict: dust. The emperor who wanted immortality through art had been forgotten, buried beneath the city he once ruled. Still, his story endures, not because of his greatness, but because of his fall. Nero reminds us that power and genius can consume each other, that the line between artist and tyrant is perilously thin. He is the eternal warning that brilliance without mercy becomes ruin. So when we look back on the final 24 hours of Nero, we don't just see a tyrant dying in fear. We see a man consumed by the same flame he once thought he could control. The emperor who lit his city aflame finally faced the fire within himself. And as dawn broke over the ashes of his empire, Rome moved on. But the legend of Nero refused to rest. His voice, faint and ghostly, still echoes through time. "What an artist dies in me." And that concludes the story of the final 24 hours of Nero was far worse than you think. If this tale left you with chills, make sure to leave a like, share it with those who love history's darkest corners, and subscribe for more stories that reveal the human faces behind the myths. Let us know in the comments. Was Nero the villain history made him out to be, or just another soul destroyed by the crown he wore? Because sometimes the greatest tragedies aren't the ones that burn cities, but the ones that burn inside the people who rule them.